In the late summer of 1940, as daylight battles over Britain began to shift against Germany, a new and far more terrifying phase of the war emerged, one that unfolded under the cover of darkness. The skies, once filled with the roar of dogfights and contrails, became eerily silent by day, but by night they came alive again with a different kind of menace. This was the beginning of the Blitz. Night after night, waves of German bombers crossed the English Channel, slipping through the darkness almost untouched. Cities like London, Coventry, and Birmingham became targets in a relentless campaign designed not just to destroy infrastructure, but to break the will of an entire nation. Fires burned through the night, air raid sirens became a constant soundtrack, and millions of civilians sought shelter underground, never knowing if their homes would still be standing by morning. For the German Luftwaffe, night bombing offered a powerful advantage. During the day, British fighter aircraft had proven to be a formidable obstacle, intercepting and disrupting bombing formations with increasing success. But at night, everything changed. Visibility dropped to near zero, making it incredibly difficult for defenders to locate incoming aircraft, let alone intercept them. The darkness became a shield, allowing German bombers to operate with a level of freedom that was simply impossible during daylight hours. Navigation technologies gave the attackers an additional edge. Using a combination of radio beams and dead reckoning, German crews were able to find their targets with surprising accuracy. Meanwhile, on the ground, British defenses struggled to adapt. Searchlights scanned the skies, hoping to catch a glimpse of an enemy aircraft, but often found nothing but empty clouds. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the darkness, guided more by sound than sight, their shells bursting harmlessly in the vast night sky. The Royal Air Force, so effective during the day, found itself nearly blind at night. Early night fighters lacked the tools needed to locate enemy bombers in the dark. Pilots relied on visual contact, which was rare and fleeting. Even when a bomber was spotted, closing the distance and maintaining position for an attack was incredibly difficult. Coordination between ground observers and pilots was slow and unreliable, leaving large gaps in the defense. In this environment, German bombers like the Ju-88 thrived. Fast, versatile, and capable of carrying significant bomb loads, it became one of the key aircraft of the campaign. Its speed made interception even more challenging, and its ability to operate effectively at night allowed it to strike deep into British territory with reduced risk. Crews grew increasingly confident, flying mission after mission with the knowledge that the odds were largely in their favor. But the impact of these raids went beyond the physical destruction. The psychological toll on Britain was immense. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble, historic landmarks were damaged or destroyed, and families were forced to live in constant fear. Sleep became a luxury, interrupted by sirens and explosions. Yet, despite the devastation, something unexpected began to take shape. Rather than collapsing under the pressure, British morale hardened. Communities came together in shelters, sharing stories, songs, and quiet determination. Emergency services worked tirelessly, often under fire, to rescue survivors and contain the damage. Factories adapted, continuing production even as bombs fell nearby. The very intensity of the attacks seemed to strengthen the resolve of the population. Strategically, however, the situation remained deeply concerning. The Luftwaffe's ability to strike at will during the night meant that Britain was under continuous threat. Industrial output, transportation networks, and civilian infrastructure were all vulnerable. If left unchecked, the bombing campaign had the potential to seriously weaken the country's ability to continue the war. Military planners knew that something had to change. The existing defenses were simply not enough. The challenge was clear. How do you fight an enemy you cannot see?
How do you intercept aircraft that vanish into the darkness before you can even find them? It was a problem that demanded not just courage, but innovation. At this stage of the war, the balance of power during nighttime operations clearly favored Germany. The Luftwaffe had found a way to bypass Britain's strongest defenses, turning the night into a domain of fear and uncertainty. Each successful raid reinforced the belief that they held the upper hand, that Britain was vulnerable, and that continued pressure might eventually force a breaking point. But beneath the surface, change was already beginning. Quietly, almost invisibly, new ideas were being tested, new technologies were being developed, and within the RAF, there was a growing understanding that the night did not have to belong to the enemy forever. What the German crews did not yet realize was that their greatest advantage, the darkness itself, was about to be taken away from them.
At first, the British response to night bombing was defined by confusion, improvisation, and frustration. The Royal Air Force had built its reputation on daylight combat, where speed, visibility, and coordination gave pilots a fighting chance. But at night, those advantages disappeared completely. The enemy was still there, flying over cities, dropping bombs, but for the defenders, it was like trying to fight a ghost. Radar did exist at this stage, but it was limited and imperfect. Early systems could detect incoming aircraft at long range, but they struggled to provide the precise information needed for interception. Controllers on the ground could tell that enemy bombers were approaching, but guiding a fighter pilot to the exact position of a moving target in total darkness was another matter entirely. By the time a pilot reached the general area, the bomber could be miles away. Inside the cockpit, the situation was even more difficult. Pilots flew through black skies with almost no visual references. There were no city lights to guide them. Blackouts ensured that everything below was cloaked in darkness. The horizon disappeared, and even maintaining orientation became a challenge. Spotting an enemy aircraft required a combination of luck, sharp eyesight, and sometimes sheer instinct. A faint silhouette against the clouds, a brief flicker of exhaust flame. These were often the only clues. Searchlights became one of the primary tools for defense. Massive beams of light swept across the sky, trying to catch bombers in their glare. When they succeeded, it created a moment of opportunity. A bomber caught in a cone of light was suddenly exposed, its position revealed to both anti-aircraft gunners and any nearby fighters. But these moments were rare. The sky was vast, and the bombers were fast. More often than not, the searchlights illuminated nothing at all. Anti-aircraft guns, positioned around major cities, fired thousands of shells into the night. The explosions created bursts of light in the sky, but accuracy was limited. Gunners relied on sound, estimation, and basic tracking data, often firing at where they believed the bombers might be, rather than where they actually were. It was a defensive effort that looked impressive, but achieved relatively little against well-organized night raids. Communication added another layer of complexity. Ground stations, observers, and pilots all had to work together, but the systems in place were not designed for the demands of night interception. Information was delayed, sometimes incomplete, and often outdated by the time it reached the pilot. A fighter could be directed toward a target that had already passed through the area minutes earlier. The result was a cycle of missed opportunities and growing frustration. Despite these challenges, the RAF did not stand still. Engineers, scientists, and military planners began searching for solutions. The key question was simple but revolutionary. What if pilots didn't need to rely on sight alone? What if they could see the enemy using technology? This idea led to rapid developments in airborne radar. Unlike ground-based systems, which provided only general guidance, airborne radar could, in theory, allow a pilot to detect and track an enemy aircraft directly from the cockpit. Early versions were bulky, unreliable, and difficult to operate, but they represented a crucial breakthrough. For the first time, there was a possibility of turning the darkness from a disadvantage into an advantage.
At the same time, new tactics were being developed. Instead of relying solely on visual interception, the RAF began experimenting with coordinated approaches where ground controllers would guide fighters into approximate positions and onboard systems would take over for the final approach. It was a complex process requiring precise timing and careful communication, but it offered a path forward. Training also evolved. Pilots had to learn entirely new skills, how to fly and fight in darkness, how to trust instruments over their own senses, and how to operate unfamiliar equipment under intense pressure. It was demanding and often dangerous. Accidents were common, and the margin for error was extremely small. Yet, slowly, experience began to build. Meanwhile, the German Luftwaffe continued its operations with confidence. From their perspective, the situation remained favorable. Bombers crossed into British airspace night after night, facing limited resistance. Losses were relatively low compared to daylight missions, reinforcing the belief that night bombing was the safest and most effective strategy. But beneath that surface confidence, the balance was beginning to shift. The RAF were learning, adapting, and improving. Each failed interception provided valuable lessons. Each technological breakthrough brought them one step closer to a solution. The struggle to stop night raiders was not a single moment of victory, but a gradual transformation. It was a battle fought not just in the skies, but in laboratories, workshops, and command centers. And as new tools and tactics began to come together, the RAF was preparing to do something that had once seemed impossible: hunt and destroy enemy bombers in complete darkness. The stage was set for a dramatic change, one that would soon catch the Luftwaffe completely off guard.
By late 1940, as the bombing of Britain continued night after night, a quiet transformation was taking place behind the scenes, one that would soon challenge everything the Luftwaffe thought it understood about night warfare. At the center of this change was an aircraft that, at first glance, didn't seem revolutionary at all. The Bristol Beaufighter was not originally designed to be a night fighter. In fact, it was developed as a heavy fighter variant of the earlier Bristol Beaufort, itself intended for maritime strike missions. The design was practical, even somewhat improvised. Engineers at the Bristol Aeroplane Company needed a powerful, long-range aircraft quickly, and instead of starting from scratch, they adapted what they already had. What they created, however, would become one of the most important aircraft of the war. The Beaufighter was large, solid, and heavily built. It wasn't as sleek or agile as single-engine fighters like the Supermarine Spitfire, but it didn't need to be. It had something far more valuable for the role it was about to take on: space, power, and endurance. Its twin engines gave it the ability to carry heavier equipment, fly longer missions, and absorb more damage than lighter aircraft. And that extra space would soon be filled with something that changed everything: airborne radar. At the time, this technology was still in its infancy. The idea of placing radar equipment inside an aircraft and expecting it to function reliably in combat was bold, even risky. Early radar sets were bulky, complex, and required a dedicated operator. Inside the Beaufighter's cockpit, this meant adding a second crew member whose job was to interpret the radar signals and guide the pilot toward the target. It was a completely new way of fighting. Instead of searching the sky with their eyes, crews could now scan the darkness electronically. Blips on a small screen represented aircraft ahead. Distance, direction, and relative movement could be estimated. For the first time, a pilot didn't need to see the enemy to find them. At first, the system was far from perfect. Signals could be confusing, interference was common, and the range was limited. But even with these limitations, it offered something the RAF had never had before: a reliable method of locating enemy bombers at night. The introduction of the Beaufighter into operational service marked a turning point. Squadrons equipped with this new aircraft began flying night interception missions, guided by a combination of ground radar and their own onboard systems.
The process required coordination and trust. Ground controllers would direct the fighter into the general vicinity of incoming bombers, and then the onboard radar operator would take over, guiding the pilot step by step until the target was within range. It was slow, methodical, and incredibly tense. In the darkness, with no visual contact, the pilot relied entirely on instructions. Small adjustments in heading, slight changes in altitude, each movement bringing them closer to an unseen target. Then, at the final moment, the bomber would appear, often suddenly, silhouetted against the faint glow of the night sky or illuminated by distant fires below. And by then, it was usually too late. One of the earliest operational successes came in late 1940, around the same time German bombers believed they had near total freedom in the night skies. What they encountered instead was something entirely unexpected, a fighter that could find them in complete darkness, close in without warning, and strike with devastating precision. German intelligence had underestimated this threat. Reports of British night fighters equipped with radar were either dismissed or not fully understood. The assumption remained that darkness provided safety. That assumption was about to be shattered. The Beaufighter was not just a new aircraft, it represented a new system of warfare. It combined technology, coordination, and firepower into a single platform. It turned the night from a place of vulnerability into a hunting ground. For the crews who flew it, the experience was unlike anything before. They were pioneers, operating at the edge of what was technically possible. Every mission carried uncertainty, but also the knowledge that they were part of something groundbreaking. And for the Luftwaffe crews, the change was subtle at first. A bomber that failed to return, a mission where losses were slightly higher than expected. Nothing dramatic, nothing that immediately suggested a fundamental shift, but gradually the pattern began to emerge. The night was no longer safe. Unseen, unheard, and almost impossible to escape, the Beaufighter had arrived, and it was only just beginning to show what it could do.
What made the Beaufighter truly terrifying was not just its ability to find enemy bombers in the dark, it was what happened once it did. Because unlike earlier night fighters that struggled to deliver effective attacks, this aircraft carried a level of firepower that was almost unheard of at the time. At its core were four 20mm cannons mounted in the lower fuselage. These were not machine guns designed to pepper a target over time. These were heavy weapons capable of tearing through metal, fuel tanks, and crew compartments in seconds. When all four fired together, they unleashed a concentrated stream of explosive shells that could devastate a bomber almost instantly. In practical terms, this meant that a single well-placed burst was often enough. The approach itself was a carefully controlled process. Guided by onboard radar, the Beaufighter would close in from behind or below, staying outside the enemy's line of sight. The radar operator would call out distance, 1 mile, half a mile, closing fast. The pilot would adjust speed and position with precision, keeping the aircraft steady in the darkness. There was no room for error. At around a few hundred meters, visual contact would finally be made. The silhouette of the bomber would emerge, sometimes faint, sometimes sharply outlined against the glow of fires on the ground. In that brief moment, the pilot had to align perfectly. Too early, and the target might slip away. Too late, and the risk of collision became very real. Then came the attack. The cannons would open fire, and the effect was immediate and brutal. Explosive rounds slammed into the bomber's structure, ripping through wings and fuselage. Fuel tanks could ignite, engines could fail, and control surfaces could be destroyed almost instantly. In many cases, the bomber crews had little or no warning. One moment they were flying in formation, the next they were fighting for survival, or not surviving at all. Compared to the lighter armament of earlier fighters, this was a completely different level of lethality. Machine guns required sustained fire and precise aiming over time. The Beaufighter's cannons delivered overwhelming force in a single short burst. It was efficient, decisive, and incredibly hard to defend against. German bombers like the Junkers Ju-88, which had performed so effectively during the early stages of the night campaign, suddenly found themselves vulnerable. Their defensive guns were designed to engage visible threats, usually approaching from predictable angles. But against an attacker that appeared out of the darkness with no warning, those defenses were far less effective. Many crews never even saw what hit them. Reports began to filter back. Pilots spoke of aircraft being destroyed without explanation, of sudden flashes and explosions in the night. Some described brief encounters with fast-moving fighters that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. There was confusion, then concern, and eventually a growing realization that something had changed. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe crews was significant. Night missions, once considered relatively safe compared to daylight operations, became increasingly tense. The darkness no longer felt like a hiding place. It felt like a hiding place for an unseen enemy. Every shadow, every unexplained signal carried the possibility of danger. Tactically, the Luftwaffe began to face a problem it had not anticipated. Their entire night bombing strategy relied on reduced interception risk. If that assumption was no longer valid, then the balance of the campaign was shifting. Crews were forced to adapt, flying at different altitudes, altering routes, and trying to minimize exposure. But these changes often reduced bombing accuracy and overall effectiveness. Meanwhile, the RAF continued to refine its methods. Coordination between ground control and airborne radar improved. Pilots gained experience, becoming more confident in night operations. Interceptions became more frequent, more precise, and more lethal. The Beaufighter was no longer an experimental tool. It was becoming a dominant force in the night sky. What made it so effective was not just any single feature, but the combination of all its elements. Radar allowed it to find targets. Twin engines gave it the power and endurance to operate for extended periods, and its 4 cannons ensured that once contact was made, the outcome was often decisive. This combination created a new kind of threat, one that could not be easily countered with existing tactics. For the German crews, the change was undeniable. Missions that once felt routine now carried a growing sense of risk. Losses increased, and confidence began to erode. The night, which had once belonged to them, was becoming contested. And as more Beaufighters took to the skies, that contest was turning into something far more dangerous.
By early 1941, the shift was no longer subtle. It was undeniable. What had once been a campaign defined by German confidence and British vulnerability was rapidly transforming into something very different. The night skies over Britain, once dominated by the Luftwaffe, were becoming increasingly dangerous for the very bombers that had once moved through them with near impunity. The introduction of the Bristol Beaufighter, combined with improving radar coordination and refined interception tactics, began to produce measurable results. More German aircraft were being intercepted, more bombers were failing to return, and perhaps most importantly, the sense of safety that had defined night operations for the Luftwaffe was beginning to disappear. For the Royal Air Force, this marked the beginning of a new kind of defense, one that didn't rely on reacting blindly, but on actively hunting the enemy. Night fighter squadrons became more organized, more confident, and far more effective. Ground control stations and airborne crews worked in increasingly seamless coordination, turning what had once been a chaotic effort into a structured and deadly system. Instead of waiting for bombers to reach their targets, RAF fighters began intercepting them earlier, disrupting formations, and forcing crews to take evasive action. This had a direct impact on bombing accuracy. Targets were missed,
Payloads were dropped prematurely, and missions that once delivered precise darbots became far less effective. For the Luftwaffe, this created a growing dilemma. Continuing the night bombing campaign meant accepting higher and higher losses. Crews had to fly longer, more complex routes to avoid interception, often at different altitudes and under stricter conditions. These adjustments reduced efficiency and increased fatigue, placing additional strain on both pilots and aircraft. Attempts were made to adapt. German forces experimented with new navigation techniques, electronic countermeasures, and revised tactics designed to confuse British defenses. But these measures struggled to keep pace with the rapid improvements on the other side. The fundamental problem remained. The RAF now had the ability to find and destroy bombers in the dark. The psychological effect was just as significant as the physical losses. Air crews who once viewed night missions as a safer alternative to daylight operations now faced constant uncertainty. Every mission carried the possibility of sudden, unseen attack. Reports of Beaufighters appearing without warning, striking with devastating force, and disappearing back into the darkness spread quickly among crews. Confidence began to erode. At the same time, Britain itself was changing. While the early months of the Blitz had brought destruction and fear, the growing effectiveness of night defenses provided a sense of reassurance. The idea that the enemy could be fought, even in the darkness, became a powerful symbol of resilience. Civilian morale, tested so heavily in the beginning, found new strength in the knowledge that the balance was shifting. Strategically, the impact was profound. The German bombing campaign, which had aimed to cripple British industry and break civilian will, was losing its effectiveness. Damage was still being inflicted, but at a higher cost and diminishing returns. The ability to sustain large-scale, effective night raids was gradually slipping away. Over time, the focus of German operations began to change. Resources were redirected, priorities shifted, and the intensity of the Blitz decreased. While bombing did not stop entirely, it no longer carried the same level of threat or strategic momentum as it once had. The night skies over Britain had been transformed. What began as a desperate struggle against an unseen enemy had evolved into a demonstration of innovation, adaptation, and determination. The combination of radar technology, coordinated defense systems, and aircraft like the Beaufighter had not only countered the Luftwaffe's advantage, it had reversed it. And beyond the immediate impact on the war, something even more important had been established. A new model of aerial warfare had emerged, one where technology and information were just as critical as speed and firepower. The ability to detect, track, and engage targets beyond visual range would go on to define the future of air combat. The Luftwaffe entered the night believing it held the advantage. For a time it did, but that advantage was never permanent. Quietly, steadily, and with remarkable ingenuity, Britain had taken the darkness itself and turned it into a weapon. By the time the full implications became clear, it was already too late.